What is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome into part 2 of my start and sit videos for this week. If you already checked out the Thursday, Friday matchups, you know we're doing things a little bit differently this week. We are going through every single matchup and every single position in these videos this week. We are not splitting it out by positions because we've got to get the videos out way quicker this week than what we typically do. Thanksgiving unfortunately pushes everything back 24 hours, and we've got to try and fit all of those videos in during that time. And before we start talking about the Sunday and Monday matchups, I gotta remind everybody that Black Friday is when we open up pre-sales for our 2025 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. If you want to pre-order yours at a discounted rate, then keep an eye on all of our social media accounts, including here on YouTube, and we'll make sure that we post all of those links on Black Friday so you can get yours ordered and get ready for 2025, even though 2024 is still in play. And for our first matchup, the Chargers are going to be heading into Atlanta, and I really got to hope that J.K. Dobbins is going to end up being healthy for this game because the Chargers are absolutely going to need him to be able to stay balanced. Gus Edwards scored a touchdown on Monday Night Football, but he averaged 1.7 yards per carry. Gus Edwards is not the guy that I want to try going into this matchup with. Hopefully J.K. Dobbins didn't suffer too much of an injury with that knee, and he'll be able to return this week and be just fine. We'll keep an eye on that, and he's going to be a medium risk as of right now, but if he ends up being limited for the majority of the week, we may need to reconsider that rating. The connection from Justin Herbert to his wide receivers will definitely be one of the most important ones in this game, especially if J.K. Dobbins ends up missing. The Atlanta secondary is definitely way easier to try and go up against than their run defense. And right now, the Atlanta Falcons defense is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, and they're allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, while also allowing the 3rd most receiving touchdowns this season. Ladd McConkey is an easy low-risk play, just like Justin Herbert will be in this matchup. Quentin Johnston, he crapped the bed this past week. He had 5 targets. He had a massive drop. He didn't catch any of those targets. It was one of those bad games. But it feels like Justin Herbert is going to go back to him in this game just to make a point. Herbert defended him in their post-game press conference, and now he's going to want to get Quentin Johnston back on track. I wouldn't be surprised if they take a couple of deep shots. Since their bye in week 5, Will Dissly has only had 1 game with less than 4 targets. His upside isn't all that great right now, and he doesn't have a ton of touchdown potential, but he is seeing a decent target share on this team. And sometimes at the tight end position, that's what we just need to chase in order to have a decent floor. The Ravens may have beat the Chargers on Monday Night Football, but the Chargers defense definitely established themselves as one of the better defenses in all of football. They held Lamar Jackson to only 177 passing yards. He did throw a couple of touchdowns and he ran for another one, but that yardage right there is a pretty good indication of the fact that this Chargers defense does a really good job of containing any type of quarterback. And yeah, Derrick Henry had a big day on the ground, but he's really the first running back that's been able to accomplish that against this Chargers defense all season long. When you take a look at this Atlanta team this week, you have to really limit your expectations in terms of their upside. For the most part, wide receivers have been pretty mediocre against the Los Angeles Chargers. So while Kirk Cousins and Darnell Mooney with Drake London could definitely find themselves with top 24 floors, top 12 ceilings would be something difficult to find without some scores to go with it. Kirk Cousins is going to need to throw for 250 yards and a couple of touchdowns. Darnell Mooney and Drake London are both going to have to come really close to 100 receiving yards, and if not, they're going to need to add a touchdown if they want any shot at even looking at the top 12. Now, even with Derrick Henry's performance, the Chargers are still allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, so things will not be easy for Bijan Robinson this week, and making an impact in the passing game is going to be absolutely critical to him being a top 12 running back. But the Chargers do a really good job at limiting passing work to opposing running backs. And while Bijan to me this week is not a top 6 running back, I do believe based on his passing work and his work on the ground that he could still find himself really close, if not just inside the top 12. Not a lot of people are going to be able to put up performances like the King, but maybe Bijan can at least get close to it. And then for the tight end position, the Chargers are a little bit more forgiving to the tight end position than what they are for wide receivers. But Kyle Pitts is based on two things: big plays and touchdowns. We know that the targets have been inconsistent all season long. And while we might not be able to rely on a bunch of targets, we have to hope that he gets a big play or two. And if not, he scores a touchdown to make him fantasy viable. The Cincinnati Bengals find themselves in a must-win matchup coming out of the bye, going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And hopefully both of these offenses show up ready to play. Russell Wilson is getting himself a really nice matchup this week, and so is George Pickens. Right now, Cincinnati is allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. And the Cincinnati defense going up against wide receivers is just outside the top 10 of most fantasy points, touchdowns, and receiving yards allowed to wide receivers. And while Russell Wilson will be a medium risk because he's shown to be a better QB2 this season than he has been a QB1, that upside has been limited, and he's kind of sitting right in the middle of giving you solid numbers, but maybe not enough to win your week. But it really doesn't matter when it comes to George Pickens, because even though Russell Wilson is a medium, Pickens is a low risk because of his target share in this offense right now, his big playability, and then this week having a pretty favorable matchup against the Bengals secondary. Now let's go ahead and just chalk this up to another week of me complaining about the fact that Jaylen Warren isn't getting more touches than Najee Harris. Last week, Jaylen Warren scored a touchdown and he averaged 4.1 yards per carry, which is okay but not great, but Najee Harris only averaged 2.6 yards per carry. When Jaylen Warren has been healthy, he has been far and beyond the most efficient back between these two guys, but for some reason he's not getting more touches. However, this week against Cincinnati, I think this is the week where we see him kind of start to take the backfield a little bit more. And they use his big play ability to really stick in this game and then hopefully continue to move forward, especially with any type of a lead, at pounding the football and keeping it on their side. This Cincinnati defense is a great matchup for Pat Freiermuth. They're currently allowing the 5th most receiving yards to tight ends, but they're also allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game and touchdowns to tight ends. But the problem is Pat Freiermuth saw 4 targets last week. That's the most targets he's seen in a game since week 4. He's just not getting a ton of looks and a ton of opportunity. So if you're trying to start him this week, he's definitely way closer to being a high risk play than a low risk play, but if you're looking for a good matchup, you won't be able to find much more than this one. Cincinnati's going to have their hands full with the Pittsburgh defense, though, because they have shown to be one of the best defenses in all of football so far this season. And right now, going up against wide receivers, they are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game. Things are not going to be easy on Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins. Jamar Chase, though, is still going to be a low-risk play for me. Why? Because you're starting him no matter what. Put Jamar Chase in your lineup. He's going to see more than enough volume, but hopefully he turns some of those into a big play or even a touchdown. T. Higgins to me is a little bit more of a riskier start. There have been times this season where he sees more targets than Jamar Chase, but Jamar Chase is the playmaker in this offense, and I'll lean on him a little bit more than I would lean on T. Higgins. Chase Brown has had some tougher matchups here as of late, but he continues to produce, and one of the reasons why is he keeps finding the end zone. This Pittsburgh defense is tough, but they have allowed 10 rushing touchdowns on the season so far. So let's go ahead and lock in Chase Brown. Hopefully he gets a rushing touchdown, which will really help his floor because his ceiling isn't going to be all that great this week. And then for Mike Gesicki, if you want to try and roll with him in this matchup because things are going to be tougher for the wide receivers, I get it, and I understand why you would want to go that route. I'm not really all that invested in starting Mike Gesicki. He only has one fantasy viable performance over the last several weeks, even though we continue to kind of talk about his role in this offense. Definitely not something that I want to try and run out there right now, especially against this Pittsburgh defense. I feel like the Minnesota Vikings keep narrowly escaping several teams over the last few weeks, and for my Lions, I would like it if Arizona could help out a little bit and maybe give the Minnesota Vikings a loss this week. We'll see if they can keep it going, though. Minnesota and Detroit right next to each other in the NFC North, two of the better teams in football right now, and the NFC North is absolutely killing it. What a great division this season. But Arizona coming into Minnesota this week, and they're going to be getting a defense that allows a ton of yards, but they create a lot of turnovers, and that can really limit the upside, especially for a guy like Kyler Murray. Right now, when you take a look at the Minnesota defense, they're allowing the 6th most passing yards on the season, but they've created the most interceptions. So while Kyler Murray could throw for a lot of yards in this game, if he throws a bunch of picks as well, that's going to bring his ceiling way down. But the interceptions really don't negatively affect Marvin Harrison Jr. because this secondary is allowing the 2nd most receiving yards and fantasy points per game on the season to wide receivers. This is a solid matchup for Marvin Harrison Jr. to really get back on track and potentially find himself inside the top 12 once again. And for those of you out there in the fantasy playoffs, or at least trying to fight for a playoff spot, some more wide receiver 1 weeks from Marvin Harrison Jr. would be much appreciated. And Michael Wilson even has some big play upside this week as well. I'm going to put him as a medium risk, definitely not low risk at all. But if you're looking for somebody to help you find the ceiling with your team this week, Michael Wilson could be 1 or 2 plays away from doing that. I really don't want anything to do with James Conner this week, and unfortunately a lot of you out there probably don't have a choice. But right now Minnesota is allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game and rushing yards to opposing running backs, and James Conner has not looked good recently. A couple of weeks ago he did finish as the RB3, but that was due to a touchdown and 80 receiving yards on 5 receptions. Outside of that, he really has only been a low-end RB2 for a majority of the season. He hasn't even sniffed the top 12 outside of that performance since week 2. And in a matchup this tough, James Conner probably is a low-end RB2 once again, and that would be if he's lucky to find his ceiling and potentially throw in a touchdown. Sam Darnold, though, I just want to hear that he's healthy this week. He's a little bit banged up right now, but his performances the last couple of weeks have been fantastic. Going up against the Tennessee Titans and the Chicago Bears, 2 of the better pass defenses in the NFL, he has 2 touchdowns and no interceptions in both of those games. So maybe he doesn't find the ceiling in those games, but that type of floor against those type of defenses is absolutely fantastic. And going up against the Cardinals this week, I'll go ahead and give him a low risk rating, because even if he doesn't have a ton of upside, his floor is still really solid. And yeah, Justin Jefferson was a dud last week, but how often is Jordan Addison going to have over 160 receiving yards and a touchdown? It's not going to be that often. And how often does Justin Jefferson put up back-to-back dud performances? Also, not that often. For Jordan Addison, maybe this is the start of some more fantasy viability the rest of the season, but for Justin Jefferson, just take this as one of those bad performances, and hopefully he bounces back this week. Aaron Jones has been interesting so far this season. I like Aaron Jones, but he's been really mediocre. He's tossed in some good performances, but for the most part, he's given you just enough fantasy points for you to kind of turn the other way and say, yeah, still love his upside, and I'll put up with this really low floor for right now just to get some more of that upside. But since week 3, he's only been an RB1 1 time, and he only has 3 other top 24 performances to go along with it. So unfortunately, we got to look at Aaron Jones as more of an RB2 ceiling type of player instead of an RB1 ceiling type of player, which isn't all that bad, but it really depends on if you're relying on him to win you weeks. If he's your RB1 right now before the trade deadline hits, you may want to try and figure something else out. I wanted to talk about both tight ends together here at the very end, because over the last couple of years, if you remember, for Manscaped, I would do my Manscaped must-watch matchup instead of doing my Manscaped must-start player. So let's go ahead and combine the two. My Manscaped must-start players this week are going to be TJ Hawkinson and Trey McBride, and everybody's starting them, so this really isn't that big of a surprise that I'm listing them as must-starts this week. But realistically, for me, this is a must-watch matchup with 2 of the best tight ends in all of football. If you have either of these guys in your lineup, you're going to be glued to the box score for this game. TJ Hawkinson and Trey McBride are coming off 2 of the biggest weeks that we've seen for a tight end so far this season. 15 targets for Trey McBride last week, over 100 receiving yards for TJ Hawkinson, who is officially back and looks like he's fully healthy. This matchup is going to be a fun one to watch, and I love a good battle between the tight end position. But just a heads up, over at manscaped.com, they have a huge Black Friday sale going on. And typically our code Headliners20 will get you 20% off your entire order, but guess what? For Black Friday, it's going to get you an additional 5% off. So So if you've been looking for stocking stuffers or things to throw under the tree for family members, loved ones, or whoever, head on over to manscaped.com. Use code word headliners20 for 25% off your entire order and free shipping this Black Friday. Indianapolis at New England is all about bounce back potential this week because Jonathan Taylor and Ramondre Stevenson had really poor performances in week 12. And now we need them back on track in week 13. And both of them have a really solid matchup to be able to do that. New England is currently allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game and 4th most rushing yards to running backs. And Indianapolis is allowing the 3rd most rushing yards and 5th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Both Ramondre Stevenson and Jonathan Taylor should be locked in for good workloads this week in a solid matchup. Now, JT, I feel way better about. JT could end up being a top 5 running back this week. Ramondre Stevenson might be a little bit more concerning, and the reason is last week's matchup against Miami was a solid matchup, and he couldn't do anything with it. However, part of the issue may have been just game script. Miami was leading consistently throughout that game, and by the end of the game, they had a pretty large lead, and Antonio Gibson started to play more and more last week. I'm going to go ahead and chalk that up to only game script, and the fact that Indianapolis probably will not do that to New England. I also don't mind either quarterback in this matchup either. I think Drake May has a way better floor than what Anthony Richardson does, but I do believe Anthony Richardson has a much higher upside. Indianapolis is currently allowing the 5th most passing yards to quarterback, but Drake May's issue over the last 4 weeks has been interceptions. 5 interceptions over the last 4 weeks, and those interceptions have just knocked him outside of being a top 12 quarterback on multiple occasions. This week, if he can limit those upsides and keep the ball clean, he could find himself inside the top 12. New England's defense right now is allowing the 7th most passing yards and touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks, and Anthony Richardson was just the QB4 a couple of weeks ago against the New York Jets. Against the Detroit Lions, obviously it wasn't nearly as good, but the one thing that I liked about that is going up against a team that is 2nd in interceptions right now, he didn't turn the ball over, and that is really important for him and his development. This matchup going up against the New England Patriots, hopefully he can find some of that same ceiling he did a couple weeks ago. New England is currently allowing the 6th most receiving yards to wide receivers, but it's a little too early in the week to tell what we're going to do with this situation. It does sound like, unfortunately, Josh Downs has suffered a major shoulder injury and will end up being week to week and is doubtful to play this week. So that leaves us with 3 more options. But Michael Pittman is also banged up right now. So we'll have to see later in the week whether or not he's going to play. Now, if Michael Pittman ends up playing, he's going to stay at a medium risk for me. And also Adonai Mitchell will probably end up being a medium risk as well with no Josh Downs. Alec Pierce will stay at a high risk though, because really he needs a couple of big plays to make things happen. But if for some reason Michael Pittman isn't going to play, then Alec Pierce is going to become a medium risk along with Adonai Mitchell. If I had to guess, the best ceiling this week with Josh Downs being out would be Alec Pierce. He has the most upside and the most touchdown potential out of this group. It's going to be really risky to play him, but he could end up paying huge dividends with no Josh Downs. Indianapolis is allowing the 7th most receiving yards to wide receivers right now, and Demario Douglas is a really safe option. If you're looking for a good flex, it's Demario Douglas. A good wide receiver 3, it's Demario Douglas. He's never going to put up a ton of points. He's never going to help you win your week, but he is definitely going to give you the points needed to be able to look at your lineup on Sunday evening and be like, okay, Demario Douglas did exactly what I needed him to do. In this matchup, Hunter Henry's the only tight end that I'm going to be looking at. Indianapolis allows the 7th most receiving yards to tight ends, and they've allowed 6 receiving touchdowns as well. Austin Hooper may have stole that touchdown last week, but once again, Hunter Henry led the team with 8 targets. And if you're taking a shot in the dark at tight ends anyway, guys who lead the team in targets in really good matchups aren't the worst shot in the world. The Seahawks and Jets are all about their Jekyll and Hyde defenses. Both of these defenses will play really great one week and then seem to disappear the next. The Jets are still allowing the 3rd fewest passing yards and 2nd fewest passing touchdowns on the season to opposing quarterbacks. And Geno Smith has showed this season he's got a really nice QB2 floor, but his ceiling is not much higher than that. And in this matchup, it will probably be a lot of the same thing. But with the New York Jets defense coming out of the bye, hopefully they've taken this time to prepare well for this game. And it could end up leading to a bit of an up and down performance from the wide receivers, but I'm still going to list JSN as a low risk start. 3 straight weeks of top 12 performances from JSN. He absolutely needs to be out there, especially considering the fact he's the guy that moves around the most and is not going to have to get stuck on the cornerbacks on the outside. That's going to come to Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf is the number 2 target in this offense right now. And then Tyler Lockett, he's getting some looks, but he's really going to be big play dependent moving forward. Kenneth Walker has been a top 24 running back every single game this season except for one. So his floor has been pretty darn good. But why hasn't he been reaching his ceiling? It's because he keeps getting tackled behind the line of scrimmage. At one point this past Sunday, for half of his carries, they were losses for tackles behind the line of scrimmage. He's getting hit before he even has an opportunity to make a move or pick up yards. And that's the big reason why Kenneth Walker has had no ceiling yet this season. And unfortunately, that offensive line may not get much better, and Walker is going to continue to be a low floor, low ceiling player. Since week 2, Aaron Rodgers has only been a top 12 quarterback one time. And apparently he's dealing with several injuries as well right now. I don't know how true that is, but if it is, it would lead us to believe that that's why he's been playing so poorly. I mean, his last 2 games, he has been awful. And because of that, it's really hurt the guys around him like Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. Aaron Rodgers is a high-risk play for right now, especially considering the fact that there's this information going around that he's not 100%, and we really don't know the extent of his injuries. For Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams, they've got to be medium-risk plays right now. Now, it's not really their fault. It goes back to Aaron Rodgers and his health, but over the last 2 weeks, these guys haven't even been fantasy viable. If we put them in our lineups, we were probably losing weeks because of them. We can't even get performances out of them that give us like wide receiver 3 type numbers. They're even finishing lower than that. Now, Breece Hall is going to be a low risk play for me, even though his ceiling hasn't been all that great as of recent. The Seattle Seahawks are allowing the 7th most rushing yards on the season. And the reason that Breece Hall is not reaching his upside right now is basically lack of passing work. Right before the bye, he was the RB3, partly because he scored a touchdown, but he also caught all 7 of his targets. And the 3 weeks prior to that, when he gave us really poor numbers and was kind of an RB2, RB3 borderline player, he only had a high of 4 targets, 4, 2, and 1 targets, and he wasn't scoring a touchdown either. His rushing yards overall are not bad. And from a pure football standpoint, he's doing just fine in that department. But from a fantasy perspective, he hasn't reached that upside as of recent because he's not scoring touchdowns and he's not getting passing work. And for the tight ends in this matchup, AJ Barner had 4 targets last week, not really enough to really make him fantasy viable right now. And Tyler Conklin over the last 3 weeks has only had 2 targets and 1 reception in each of those games. A couple of young quarterbacks will do battle in the Tennessee and Washington matchup, and while Jaden Daniels will probably get the best of Will Levis in this game, I wouldn't put it past Levis to at least put together some decent fantasy points. Right now, the Commanders are allowing the 5th most passing touchdowns on the season, and over the last couple of games, Will Levis has had at least 275 yards passing in both of those, and he only has 1 interception in his last 3 games. He's protecting the ball a whole lot better right now, and he's showing some of that upside with that big arm of his. And while the potential for turnovers definitely leads Will Levis to continue to be a risky start every single week, his wide receivers are playing pretty well right now. The volume for Calvin Ridley has made him a pretty decent wide receiver 2 pick every single week. And Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, what about him? 6 touchdowns over his last 7 games. That still makes him pretty risky in my book, but if you're looking for a shot in the dark at somebody, Ikhine could find the end zone with no problems. Tony Pollard could end up being a really safe start this week, though. Washington is currently allowing the most rushing yards to opposing running backs, and in 3 of his last 5 games, Tony Pollard has at least 20 carries. The 2 games that he didn't have 20 carries, he had 9 each, and unfortunately, it was a lot of negative game script that led to him to just kind of being phased out of the game plan, and he wasn't able to get the volume needed. If Tennessee remains close with Washington, then we definitely have an opportunity for 15 to 20 carries again for for Tony Pollard. And in this matchup, running the ball with Tony Pollard could be best to start the game. Keep the ball away from Jaden Daniels as much as possible. And for the love of God, please don't chase a big touchdown from Chigi Oko last week on only one target. Tennessee may be allowing the fewest passing yards to opposing quarterbacks right now, but they've allowed 16 passing touchdowns on the season. So the potential for some big plays absolutely will be there for the Washington Commanders this week. After back-to-back QB 24 finishes, Jaden Daniels found himself at the very top as the quarterback one with 3 total touchdowns last week, even with the 2 interceptions. But in 5 of his last 6 games, he's had at least 30 passing attempts. And right now, the running backs are banged up for the Washington Commanders. Brian Robinson Jr. is dealing with an ankle injury, and there's no guarantee that he will play this week. Even though he said he's feeling a little bit better and it's not a high sprain, he still could end up being limited or maybe just held out to be cautious. Austin Eckler, though, had his 2nd concussion of the season last week, and I highly doubt he ends up making his way onto the field for week 13. Because of that, we could see Jaden Daniels running the ball a little bit more again, just like we did last week. And of course, 30 more passing attempts could be in store. And even though Tennessee is allowing the fewest receiving yards to wide receivers right now, 30 plus passing attempts is good news for Terry McLaurin. While I would be a little bit worried that he doesn't reach his floor because of the tougher matchup, he would have the ability to still have a really decent ceiling due to touchdown potential, big play potential, and target share. And I expect the ball to be spread around a little bit as well. Zach Ertz will probably see 4, 5, 6 targets in this matchup, but once again, it really depends on how well Terry McLaurin is playing. If the wide receivers are getting open, they're going to get the targets, but if they're having a lot of trouble, Zach Ertz could step in and end up being a guy that's either 1 or 2 in targets this week. This is going to be a pretty short analysis. If you're playing the Jacksonville Jags, you're firing up all of your players. Right now, the Jaguars defense, which is absolutely awful, is inside the top 5 of most fantasy points allowed, not to just 1 or 2 or 3, but all 4 positions in fantasy football. CJ Stroud should have a safe floor and a pretty high ceiling. Joe Mixon has an absolute banger of a matchup to take advantage of and could be a top 5 running back once again this week. Nico Collins, the big time plays, the touchdowns, everything is there for him. He's a low risk play for me this week. Tank Dell had an okay week last week, decent amount of receiving yards, not showing a ton of upside. In this matchup, super safe floor, even if the upside isn't there. And then unfortunately for Dalton Schultz, he's really the one guy that I'm not taking a look at. Houston may be allowing the most passing touchdowns on the season, but they also have the 2nd most interceptions on the season as well. And one thing I can tell you about Mac Jones this week, there's a better chance that he has more interceptions than touchdowns than not. So for Mac Jones, I've got Brian Thomas Jr. as a low risk play, but that doesn't mean that Mac Jones can't get a majority of his production over to Brian Thomas Jr. And while Jones would end up sucking this week, BTJ could end up being just fine. Because Houston is allowing the most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers and the 5th most fantasy points per game to the position as well. And let's say Mac Jones throws for 190 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. What if 75, 80 of those yards go to Brian Thomas Jr. and so does that touchdown? This is something we see in the comments quite a bit from people. They're like, hey, how can you have this quarterback as a high risk, but then you have one of his wide receivers as a low risk? It's pretty simple, like I just went over, right? If you have 2 interceptions, a touchdown, and 180 passing yards, you're not fantasy viable at the quarterback position. But if 80 of those yards and a touchdown go to one wide receiver, that wide receiver is going to be super solid and has a chance at a top 12 potential that week. For the running backs in Jacksonville this week, Houston is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. And we still need to wait and hear on Tank Bigsby and how healthy he's going to be heading into this matchup. If Tank Bigsby ends up playing, it is a tough matchup for him, but he's going to have the best shot at the goal line carries, where Travis Etienne is really going to need to hope for a little bit of work in the passing game. But even against Detroit a couple of weeks ago, we didn't see a whole lot from Travis Etienne. And in this matchup with Tank Bigsby potentially being back, I'm not liking the potential either. Evan Ingram could see a decent amount of targets this week, but Houston is allowing the 5th fewest receiving yards to the tight end position. So if we can get Evan Ingram 6, 7, or 8 targets in a matchup where the wide receivers could end up having a good game or not, or whether Mac Jones needs to get rid of the ball quickly, if Evan Ingram sees a decent amount of targets, it definitely helps his floor. But this defense isn't going to allow a whole lot of big plays to tight ends, which could really limit his upside. For the sake of our fantasy teams, let's hope that the LA Rams and New Orleans matchup is a high scoring one with lots of fantasy points for everybody. A majority of the guys for the LA Rams are going to be a low risk rating for me this week. Really, the tight end position is the only one that I'm not interested in for the Rams right now. The Saints might be allowing the 4th most passing yards right now, but they're allowing the 4th fewest passing touchdowns. But that's okay. Give me all the yards possible with Matthew Stafford. It gives him a really safe floor, and then on top of that, if he can find the end zone, then we're in a position where he ends up reaching a pretty decent ceiling this week. And when you've got receivers like Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, it's going to make life a whole lot easier for everybody. These guys are going to see double-digit targets this week. It sounds like Demarcus Robinson had an arrest issue and may not even be playing this week, which means even more opportunity for these two guys. New Orleans is allowing the 5th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers right now, and if we can lock in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua both for double-digit targets, they both have touchdown potential, but they both have potential to go well over 100 yards or at least 80 yards as a floor, which means both of these guys have top 12 potential this week. New Orleans is also allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 3rd most rushing touchdowns. And if there's something Kyren Williams loves to do, it's find the end zone, and he did get back into the end zone this past week, and now he's got a really great shot of doing it once again up against the Saints. Between Taysom Hill and Alvin Kamara having the potential for a ton of touches this week, I do think it limits the upside of Derek Carr, but if this can become a shootout with the Rams playing in front of the New Orleans Saints, then Derek Carr is going to be throwing it a whole lot more. It's just the lack of receiving options right now that's a little bit of a concern. Now, MVS over the last 2 games has been the wide receiver 2 and the wide receiver 14. So going up against the Rams right now, who are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, I absolutely could see MVS having another decent week and some big playability to go along with it. Now, the LA Rams haven't been awful against the run this season, until they ran into Saquon Barkley, and then they looked like the worst run defense in all of football. I don't expect Alvin Kamara to come even close to that this week, but he should still see a solid amount of targets and a decent amount of rushing attempts in this game, and if that happens, it gives him a pretty good floor that at least puts him in the RB2 conversation, high-end RB2 conversation, and a touchdown bringing him into the top 12 convo. For the tight ends, Taysom Hill is going to be high risk, high reward as always. 10 targets 2 weeks ago before the bye, and obviously had a huge day and could be utilized very similar once again this week going up against the Rams. If you look at the other 2 tight ends though, Juwan Johnson, touchdown potential. That's what you're hoping for him. He's high risk because you need the touchdown. Whereas Foster Moreau for me is a little bit more of a medium risk because he could end up seeing more targets in this game. Believe it or not, Tampa Bay and Carolina could definitely be a game in which a lot of the projections end up being a lot lower than what the final box score shows. So after we break down this matchup, you should head on over to Underdog and sign up using code word headliners and play along with all of our pick'ems of the week, because I can promise you there's going to be quite a few lines that I'm looking at from Tampa Bay and Carolina that I think going higher than the projections could absolutely be winners. And if you get signed up over on Underdog this week, you're going to get a free pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit and a deposit bonus of up to $1,000. With the fantasy season coming to an end, you should definitely be playing some pick'ems with us and then preparing for potentially doing some best ball drafts over the offseason. Carolina allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs and opposing tight ends, and they're also allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield has been a safe start all season long, and I don't see this changing with the Carolina matchup coming up. And then also also, Bucky Irving kind of established himself as the running back one. Even though Rachaad White still got a touchdown and he's still going to be implemented into the game plan, Bucky Irving may be the guy moving forward. And in this matchup, it wouldn't shock me for Bucky Irving to have another really nice fantasy day, while Rachaad White still will have some touchdown potential and could find the end zone. Really, the only wide receiver I want to roll with in this matchup is going to be Mike Evans. When you take a look at Jalen McMillan and Sterling Shepard, those guys could go back and forth as the wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. So let's just invest in the best guy on this offense and go with him to have a solid day. And then Cade Otton could definitely get back on track this week. 3 targets last week, only caught one of them for 30 yards, but he wasn't really needed. They dominated the New York Giants basically the entire game. I think this game going up against Carolina could be a lot closer because Carolina pushed the Kansas City Chiefs last week. The Chiefs needed everything that they could to beat them, and Bryce Young looked super solid. And Tampa Bay is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game right now to the quarterback position. So even if we see stats similar to last week, 260 passing yards, 1 touchdown, if Bryce Young takes care of the football and doesn't have a turnover, he might only be like a quarterback 2, but in Superflex and 2 QB leagues, he definitely gives you an advantage. But the wide receivers are what can end up helping this week. Now, David Moore had the best week last week, and I'm not really ready to invest in him consistently, but going up against Tampa Bay, I could see Xavier Legette having some big touchdown potential and some big play potential, but being a little bit riskier where Adam Thielen could have a really solid floor of at least a flex option. And last week, Chuba Hubbard had 58 yards on 16 carries and a touchdown against the #1 run defense in football, the Kansas City Chiefs. This matchup, not great, but it is better than that one. And Chuba Hubbard should be super safe to throw out there once again. Jatavian Sanders was a big play for me last week, and unfortunately he had that neck injury. Everything points to him being okay, but he's not going to be back on the field. So Tommy Tremble will be the tight end 1 this week. And with one less person out on the field rotating at the tight end position, it wouldn't shock me if Tommy Tremble saw 5 or 6 targets this week. And since Tampa Bay allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position, he could end up being a super sneaky play for anybody that needs a tight end streamer. Baltimore's defense is still allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks and the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers still. So Jalen Hurts to AJ Brown should be on full display in this game. And then Devontae Smith, if he's able to go, he's going to end up being a medium risk instead of a high risk for some big play potential as well. Now, with the run game in Saquon Barkley, maybe he doesn't run for over 250 yards this week, but he should still end up having an okay day. Baltimore's run defense, though, is way better than what he faced last week with the Rams. Baltimore is allowing the 3rd fewest rushing yards so far on the season, but this is exactly like Derrick Henry in this matchup. We're going to put both of these guys as a safe start. Philly's defense is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position right now. But guess what? The team that allows the 4th fewest, the Los Angeles Chargers, couldn't stop Derrick Henry last week anyway. So even though these are both tough defenses on the ground, Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry are still going to be in your lineup, and you're still going to be expecting a pretty safe floor. Now, Dallas Goedert could definitely be a factor this week. The Baltimore defense allows the 2nd most receiving yards to the tight end position. And depending on if Devontae Smith plays or not, Dallas Goedert could see quite a bit of targets. So we'll keep an eye on that throughout the rest of the week. The Baltimore passing attack could be under a whole lot more stress than what Phillies will in this matchup. Right now, Philadelphia is allowing the 2nd fewest passing yards to quarterbacks and the 4th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers. When it comes to Lamar Jackson, he only has 3 interceptions on the season, and we know that he can beat you in way more ways than just through the air. So he's still going to be a safe start for me this week, and he's in your lineups no matter what. Zay Flowers a little bit riskier for me than what I would like, but his target share alone kind of keeps that safe floor exactly where we would like it to be. But the X factor this week has to be Mark Andrews. Right now, Philadelphia is allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the tight end position. But if the matchups on the outside are going to be difficult, Lamar Jackson needs somebody to step up. And that could end up being Mark Andrews. It is a tough matchup, and he's definitely a lot closer to being a high risk than a low risk. But more than likely, you don't have a whole lot of options to play over Mark Andrews anyway. San Francisco at Buffalo was probably once seen as a potential Super Bowl matchup, but the San Francisco 49ers are fading quickly, and there's no telling at this point whether or not Brock Purdy is going to be ready to go for Sunday Night Football, and that's going to make all the difference here. If we don't have any Brock Purdy this week, it's going to be really hard to play anybody outside of Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle, especially considering the performances that we saw last week. Juwan Jennings had 40 yards on 5 receptions. Not bad. As long as you flexed him and you weren't expecting a lot of upside, then that's fine. But Deebo Samuel didn't do jack, and because of that, a lot of fantasy owners were left in the dust. And if Brandon Allen is going to end up being the starter again this week with no Brock Purdy, it's going to be hard for me to really trust either of those guys. I would go with Juwan Jennings to kind of have the same floor as he did last week, but I don't know if I could trust Deebo Samuel, so we'll have to keep a big eye on that the rest of the week. And Brock Purdy will remain a high risk right now just because we don't know whether or not he's going to be able to go. Now, Buffalo does allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Christian McCaffrey could be golden this week, and they're really going to need him if they don't have Brock Purdy. Now, does that mean they'll collapse on the run a little bit? Possibly, but he's still going to get work in the passing game. And for George Kittle, it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. He's the main weapon in this offense right now. He sees the most targets and the most consistent production. San Francisco may be allowing the 3rd fewest passing yards on the season, but Josh Allen is playing at another level right now, and he'll be in the MVP conversation come the end of the season. So this matchup to me isn't really that big of a concern. James Cook, he gets a decent opportunity to score this week. San Francisco is tied for the 3rd most rushing touchdowns allowed, but from an overall volume perspective, they don't allow a ton of yards. So James Cook may be regulated to really needing a touchdown to reach that upside this week. In half PPR formats with 8 receptions and 70 receiving yards, Khalil Shakir was still only the wide receiver 30. So the ceiling isn't that great with him, but he also has a floor of about 8 to 9 fantasy points. So if you're utilizing him as your wide receiver 3 or a flex option, he really isn't disappointing you all that much, and he's giving you good value for where you ended up drafting him at. Just hope that the ceiling gets a little bit higher, but if I got to deal with 11 fantasy points per week, I absolutely will. Now in full PPR leagues, you're going to get a little bit of a higher ceiling. San Francisco is allowing the 2nd fewest receiving yards to tight ends right now, and we don't know yet about Dalton Kincaid and how healthy he may be for this week. So as of right now, both Buffalo tight ends are going to remain high risk. Is Monday Night Football going to be a defensive slugfest or an offensive onslaught this week with Cleveland and Denver going against each other? It definitely could end up going both ways. And for Jameis Winston, going up against this Denver secondary, it could be one of those 300-yard, 3-interception days. He could also throw for 250, 2 touchdowns, and not throw an interception. But Denver is allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game on the season right now. So if Jameis Winston doesn't take care of the football, his fantasy points could likely be in the same area, even if he throws for a few hundred yards. And at the wide receiver position, Denver's allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers right now. And it's really hard to tell who's going to be the wide receiver 1 any given week. Now, Jerry Jeudy could end up becoming a medium start if Cedric Tillman doesn't return this week. He ended up suffering that concussion on Thursday Night Football, but he could end up clearing since they had a few extra days playing earlier in the week. But I really need everybody to be very careful with Nick Chubb. Lots of people are excited over his 2 touchdowns last week, and I'm absolutely glad for that. However, this week, it may not be nearly as nice as you're hoping for. You see those 2 touchdowns and you think Nick Chubb is back, big game incoming. It's an okay matchup for him, but the problem is the rushing yards associated with it, because he only averaged 3 yards per carry, and his longest was a run of 7 this past week. So while the touchdowns are great, and if Cleveland can move the ball down into the red zone, he has an opportunity to score again. It's in between the 20s that becomes an issue, because right now he just isn't back to being his former self, and because of that, he doesn't have the ceiling. Now, David Njoku has to have a better week, right? Like, I have no idea where this man disappeared to. He found himself inside a snow globe and apparently just disappeared into the snow because he wasn't even looked at last week when he should have been. Let's just keep our fingers crossed that Jameis Winston looks back his way this week. Cleveland is allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position right now. So we could see the Bo Nix to Courtland Sutton connection on display once again. It's been one of the hottest connections in football over the last several weeks. And Courtland Sutton coming off a couple of touchdowns touchdowns last week could end up finding the end zone once again. The matchup overall for Bo Nix is okay, and being on Monday Night Football for the first time, we'll see if he can end up showing out and show some of that upside that we've seen so far this season, especially if he gets a lot of volume in the passing game. But do me a favor, just stay away from any running back or tight end associated with the Denver Broncos, because none of them are giving you any type of fantasy upside right now. Heck, the running backs don't even give you a decent floor because we never know who the lead back is going to be any given game. So I say we just skip all of them. Let's not even deal with the headache. There's no buys this week. I'm sure we can find somebody out there to replace them. Yo, Headliner Nation, there you have it. The start and sit shows were way different this week, and hopefully you enjoyed the new format. We'll be back to the old format last week, but we needed to do something to help speed up the output of the videos this week so we can get everything out by Wednesday evening, so your lineups are set and prepared for Thursday at kickoff. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you enjoyed everything this week. Leave me some comments down below. Let me know what you thought about the layout. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're new here while turning on the bell notifications. But for now, I'm gonna get out of here. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.